Welcome to the Healthy Christian Leader. I'm Dwight Habermel. Come join me in the living room for some honest conversations. I'll be talking to guests about their journey with Christ through the joys, the challenges, and the messiness of leadership. There's always something to learn from someone's story, so let's get started.
Welcome back to the Healthy Christian Leader, everyone. I'm Rachel Habermel, and I'm very pleased to be joined today by Dr. Richard MacGillivray. Welcome back.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
We just had a great conversation about leadership, and
Right.
we're going to continue the conversation talking about team dynamics.
Okay.
And my first question in that realm is a mature team.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when we're thinking about a team that knows how to work together well, they're competent, they're effective, they're cohesive. But some teams never reach that point. How does a team mature together?
That's a good question. I think one thing that the leader should keep in mind, who's ever leading the team, is that part of the leader's job is to make that team or help that team to mature. I think a number of things are characteristic of good functioning teams. One are that information is shared among the members of the team. Even though there's a leader in the team, if you're a member of the team, it confers equal status on you as a member, even though you may have a different role and different job. And so one of the things a leader does is encourages a sense of responsibility for the team in the team members. So how do you do responsibility in the team? One of the things is that you have a responsibility to be constructive, and I think we really tried to create that. And the other is that you have the capacity to be heard. And that's important. The team exists to carry out functions. And usually if it's a team, it's got a defined function, at least a somewhat defined function. But the other thing is to provide information and feedback. And one of the best ways a leader can facilitate the development of the team is to elicit that feedback. One of the things a leader shouldn't be thrown off by is disagreement. Because disagreement is an alternative point of view, basically. And if it's constructively presented, and if it's not constructive, your job as leader is to make it constructive.
Right,
or to
kind of
help
guide
to
it
make
in that direction.
To guide it in that direction.
Yeah.
To look for solutions. It's good to identify a problem, for example, but for every problem that you identify, you need to make sure that as the leader of the team, you're trying to elicit, okay, what's the solution to that? So that when you bring up a problem, be prepared to bring up solutions for it.
That's good, yeah.
So, but the other thing is you need to have a fairly thick skin and not to personalize. I know in our earlier interviews, so we talked about thinking mistakes and so forth that people make. One of the biggest mistakes you can make as a leader is to misconstrue disagreement as something personal to you. If you're eliciting disagreement and being able to use that in order to come up with a better solution, it's a note compliment. And you should take it as such. You can personalize it in a positive sense if you like.
Yeah.
Because if people are willing to express their differing opinions, that shows their sense of safety in that workplace. It also means that they're likely to get more satisfaction out of their role.
Right, yeah.
People who don't feel they can express their point of view usually are at least vulnerable to be attracted to other kinds of roles they might play in the world, rather than being on your team. And it goes back to keeping the talent.
Definitely.
If you've got people who are good at something, let them be good at it. And going back to the earlier analogy I made in the last interview about the orchestra leader, if the piano player has a better way of playing this, as long as it works with the tune, maybe you should let the piano player do what they do well.
Right, yeah.
Rather than tell them what notes to play.
Yeah, no, that's such a good point. And I think it can be difficult sometimes to separate your own ego from your ideas.
That's
like
right.
Having thick skin as a leader sometimes is easier said than done.
That's right.
And especially if it's something, that you believe strongly in. If I'm presenting an idea to you
Yes.
and I say, I think this is the best way we can possibly do it, and you say,
Right.
respectfully, I don't think it is.
Right.
How can leaders separate their ego from what they believe in the ideas they're putting forward and what's essentially their best efforts, and someone pushing back on that and saying, I don't think that's the best route?
Right. Yeah, some of it takes some self-management. I'll come to that in a little bit. But I think part of it is know what to listen for. Because people who disagree with you, in most cases, given that people have a constructive intent in this place, as long as it's a constructive intent, their role in expressing disagreement is to make things better around here. So try to listen for what is of value and what is congruent with what your overall goals are. Because there can be more than one way to do something, and it may be good to allow people some latitude to shape that goal. The goal's got to be congruent with what you want to accomplish,
Right.
what the
Yeah.
purposes of this particular team. But I think it's important that you be actively involved in seeing, okay, what's good here. So part of that is helping you to be focused on the topic and not your particular vulnerability or hurt feelings or whatever. If people are committed to something enough to express a different way of approaching it, that might be a good sign. And it also might be something that you follow up with the person individually afterwards if this happens in a meeting context. Now, be careful how you do it. You don't want to be in the position of saying, well, see me in my office later.
Right.
Because
Sure.
that might not accomplish what you want. But I think it can be, you can say, like, this is not what I was thinking, but this is interesting, and can we follow up on this?
Right,
Can you
yeah.
and I follow up on this? I'd like you to maybe flesh this out a bit more, and for how this would work so that we can still get to this goal using the approach that you're describing.
Right, that's huge. Kind of keeping the focus on the goal itself.
That's right.
And working cooperatively with people to get there, even if that's not the original path that you may have seen.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Well, and I think to the point of kind of contradicting opinions within a group, there can be a lot of strength in a team through diversity of backgrounds, skill sets, perspectives, and opinions. And sometimes that creates really good tension, right? Like,
That's right.
It's less of an echo chamber.
That's right.
You have lots of internal resources, like very diverse resources internally. But then sometimes too much conflict can also be an issue. How can you differentiate what's healthy tension within a group from diversity of opinions and perspectives and skills, and what's toxic conflict?
Okay. Well, I think one of them is the constructiveness of it. Can you see an outcome that would work here? So, and I would give that back to my team. How would that work? You've heard from so-and-so, you've heard from so-and-so. What you're suggesting, how would that work with them? What kind of feedback do you want from them? Because you can kind of create kind of some mini leadership. Okay, you want to lead us in a particular direction. You're taking a kind of leading role yourself. How would that work? How with these other players in the group? Make it their problem to solve.
That's good, yeah.
and you're not doing this, and you're not doing this in a manipulative sense. That's how people should think. Going back to the orchestra, if you want to do a piano solo at this point, okay, what's that going to do with the woodwinds?
Yeah.
What do you hear here? Or if this is a passage that you want to play in a particular way, how is this going to affect these other instruments? Talk to them. Not just me.
Right.
And
yeah.
so I think you can model the constructive piece if you're a leader. In fact, you should always be modeling the constructive piece. And you should always be the person who's got the big goal in mind. What we keep in mind is that if people are involved in this organization, they share a certain amount of its values and a certain amount of its goals. So take advantage of that shared
That's huge.
value, the shared goal, and work in that direction so that people are seeing it from that point of view.
Well, and again, that idea of being a teacher as a leader.
That's right.
Kind of orchestrating the room and guiding people to work together.
That's right.
Yeah.
One of the things to watch for, too, is the emotion in the room. Like, what is the emotion in the room? Something I suspect that you will find a lot of, especially when things aren't going very well, is frustration. Now, frustration is a specialized form of anger. People are getting angry about obstacles. And so that can, if you're sensing frustration, as a leader, go after the obstacles.
That's good. Yeah.
Like what? Okay, and to ask the person, okay, it sounds like you want this. What's stopping you from getting it? So put it in that form, and even talk about obstacles. Like what's the block here? So that people can articulate that, and hopefully they'll find that they can. They probably share that. A lot of different members of the group will find themselves up against the same obstacles, and if they can articulate it, it's a lot easier to solve that. If people can show how they identify and encounter that obstacle.
Yeah. Well, and it sounds like as a leader in the room, you're kind of guiding the team with a bit of a map that you're trying to articulate for them. You're trying to keep the ultimate vision at the forefront. Like, this is our end goal. And then trying to prompt people to articulate what are the barriers between where we are now and that end goal.
That's right.
Yeah, that's really great.
So if you're seeing frustration in the group, it's not necessarily a bad thing, because if you're seeing it in the meeting, it's been there all along. And you need to know about this.
Right.
So that's good. You start to work on that, but you may find yourself saying that, this is something that I don't want to take up in the meeting, because everybody has a perspective on this, and I want to make sure everybody gets heard. So would people be okay? I'm going to do some follow-up with you individually, just to make sure I understand how this is all working out. So you may actually want to play it out that way. The second thing that you may find, which can be in the same basket as frustration, is discouragement, where people begin to feel that the goal of the organization will not be attained, or that their role in achieving that goal will not play out the way they want it to.
Right. Yeah.
So watch for those two things. You're probably going to see less of this in most of the kind of organizations we're talking about, which is concern for or anxiety about whether we're going to be able to do this. There are some groups where people get pretty anxious, saying, this could really go badly.
Yeah.
We could lose the business. We could, I could lose my job. Things like that, and that's very legitimate. I'm not sure that will come up so much in sort of volunteer groups and church groups and things of this kind, but certainly in private sector companies and so forth, you may need to address and be aware of and sensitive to people being anxious and their decisions and their perspectives being driven by their anxiety. One of the dangers with anxiety, not to go off on a long tangent, is it's one of the best ways to detract from a focus on the overall goal, because anxious people start looking for their own welfare, which is understandable.
For sure.
I'm not being critical when I say that, but if you think you're going to lose your job, your big concern becomes your job.
Right, you lose sight of that big end goal.
That's right.
Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting. Well, and kind of to the point of the individual versus the team, teams often have to function as a single unit.
Yes.
But people also like to know that their individual contributions are valued and they're seen and they're making a difference.
Yes.
How important is individual recognition within the health of an overall team?
I think there's a line between appreciation and recognition.
Okay.
I think as a leader, you convey appreciation frequently. Do it in small ways. It's good to do it in a group. Recognition, for sure, but recognition's a two-edged sword.
Definitely, yeah.
Because recognizing one member of the team means you didn't recognize another. And some people see this, even if it's not intended that way, and it often isn't intended this way, as a zero-sum game.
Right.
If this person gets recognized, that means I wasn't recognized. I don't get credit, or I'm not credited, or I'm not seen as making a good contribution. So it can be very dicey in how you hand out credit. You need to read the room well if you're going to give credit. You may want to do a lot of preparation. If you want to recognize somebody's particular contribution at a meeting, do your homework first, meet with people first. What do you think of this? Is there anybody else who might feel slighted if we point this out about one particular person? So, but I do think you have to give credit. The other thing is to give credible credit. There's a quote from Alice in Wonderland. Everyone has won and all must have prizes. I think we went through a phase, this was happening when my kids were small in the 90s. You participate and they give you a trophy.
The participation award.
The participation award loses the motivation of a lot of people, especially achievement-oriented people.
Yeah, it kind of waters down other accomplishments.
That's right. Yeah. If everybody gets a prize, nobody excelled. So it's okay to award and to nurture excellence. Now that sounds contradictory to what I just said. You have to be careful how you do it.
Sure.
But I think it really is important to give a credible form. So don't congratulate everybody for showing up and for work in the morning and for being on time. But it is important to recognize people's ongoing. You may at some point want to say, this person is always here. This person is always on time. You might want to make sure that those seemingly small or subtle things matter. Anyone who's ever run a meeting and have somebody be chronically late knows how important being on time is.
For sure.
And one of the best ways of knowing that your meetings aren't going well is people are showing up late. If you're the leader, ask yourself what's going on here, that this person is predictably 10 or 15 minutes late. And it may be that you'll find out that they're 10 or 15 minutes late is because you start 10 or 15 minutes late, or because somebody else is. And if you watch meetings, and I've seen this a lot, you get one or two people being late, pretty soon everybody's showing up later by the same amount of time.
You're establishing a culture.
That's right. And then the first people who were late start showing up later.
Right,
So if you have a meeting, I know this is kind of an aside, start on time. If somebody shows up late, you say, it's too bad you're late. You find out from somebody or other what you missed.
Right.
So you very quickly get the idea that you should show up on time. It is a problem. People get turned off by meetings. Most people don't like long meetings. I was saying in the break, I used to be a member of an organization where they had 4-hour meetings.
Which is very intense.
The meeting. Hated them. Even though, the topics were interesting, they were valuable, the initiatives we were trying to do were worthwhile, I didn't want to go to the meetings. I had to, as president. Well, as president-elect. But that was very, very frustrating. And meetings can be an aversive stimulus, to use a psychology term, and all animals avoid an aversive stimulus.
Right.
And sometimes the coming late or leaving early is a sign that people find it highly aversive. The other thing to watch for in your meetings is disengagement. People who aren't talking. People whose posture shows that they're not into it. Their shoulders are sagged, they're looking down, or they're yawning, things like that. So those are some things about just, if you're having the meeting, you need to be watchful all the time.
Right.
Well,
and it kind of goes to your point of, less meetings.
Less meetings.
It's kind of
meetings.
good advice for keeping the workplace engaging and making sure that you're not, kind of wasting time in those sorts of things.
Right.
Yeah.
You should be able to have a clear idea in your mind before you have a meeting of why a meeting is a better way of getting this done than any other way. If you can't answer that question for yourself, don't have the meeting.
Yeah. Yeah, I know there's a lot of sort of jokes on the internet and stuff of like, I just left another meeting that could have been an email. And I think you often have that feeling. Like, I spend a lot of times in meetings and I often leave them like, okay, yeah, I could have summarized that in an email for people.
That's right.
And you don't want people leaving with that sense because, like you said, that's going to create frustration.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Meetings, that's a good example. What is an email? It's the sharing of information. If your only reason for having the meeting is to share information, don't meet.
That's good.
Way quicker ways to do it. And with an email, you can think about how you want to say this in a good and constructive way. And it's much less danger putting your foot in your mouth.
Also very true. Yeah.
That's right.
Have a little bit more control over how it lands.
That's right. So a meeting is something that requires interaction, but you may want to do a lot to make sure you know what that interaction is going to look like, so you know where it's going to go. So if you have, especially if it's a contentious meeting, you should have most of what you're going to agree to ironed out before the meeting starts. If you look at international diplomacy, if the prime ministers and presidents and kings get together somewhere, they always come out with a statement at the end. It's always very nicely worded. That statement was written before the meeting happened, or at least most of it. They'll polish it maybe or add some things that they might have added to, because most of the things that were going to be agreed to were agreed before the meeting happened.
Right.
And it allows people to flesh out things that are just too complicated for the meeting or too contentious for the meeting. It doesn't mean you can't get, in cases like that, some useful feedback in the meeting, but you're orchestrating it so that you get useful feedback.
Yeah, that's huge. Yeah.
So,
if you're going to have a meeting, prepare for it to make sure it's the only way to get that information.
That's
yeah,
right.
That's really great. To the idea of, the sort of competitive culture.
Yes.
When does competition turn from a motivator into a hindrance? Because you made a great point earlier that competition can be a good thing. It can be motivating to individuals, but you don't want it to kind of tip over to that point where it's becoming a hindrance.
Right.
Where is that balance?
That's a good question, because, and it goes back to having the overall goal. People who compete in the context of a common overall goal usually do fine. It's like if you're on a baseball team, sometimes it's your job to bunt. Sometimes it's your job to hit a sacrifice fly to move the runner forward. We do things collaboratively. The competition should serve the overall goal, and you as a leader are going to evaluate serving that overall goal. Where competition gets to be a problem is when it serves an individual goal. If you play hockey, it's the proverbial puck hog.
Right.
Somebody who's always holding and running with and going with the puck, or skating with the puck rather, and to the detriment of the team. Their numbers may be the highest, but it's to the team detriment. I was a hockey fan when I was a kid, and not to give a hockey example, but I used to watch Chicago Blackhawks, and they had Bobby Hull, and he scored 54 goals a year, which was a spectacular number at that time, because the rest of his line fed him the puck. Chicago won the Stanley Cup once in 1961 and never won it again until late 90s, early 2000s. What happened? Well, they had a guy on the team named Phil Esposito who just kept passing the puck to Bobby. They traded Phil away. They didn't see his values. Traded him to Boston, and he scored 74 goals. the highest number of goals ever scored at that time in one of his seasons, because they hadn't recognized Phil's contribution. They hadn't allowed him to make his contribution. So that's not exactly the competition piece, but Bobby was competing for the top spot, and he's a great hockey player.
Sure.
But I think we have to look at competition as long as it serves the overall goal, great. But when you see people competing for their own benefit, then you intervene. And then that's the thing to watch for.
When it's that great point again of, as a leader, part of your goal is keeping that group vision at the forefront and making sure that everything you're doing is coming back to the shared goal of the team.
That's right.
That's really great. As a final question, as we kind of wrap up here, when we think about who's in the team and who's involved, you know, sometimes you might bring someone into a team and they're not yet perfect at everything in their role, or maybe they don't fit into the team quite right, or so on. Or how do you know as a leader when to come alongside a team member and kind of coach them and mentor them into their role, and when to let someone go?
Right. I think that mentorship should be understood as your role from the beginning. So, and that should be explicit. You should say to the person that, you know, in your startup period, you're going to see and hear a lot from me, because I want you to feel that you can lean on me a bit, and I need a lot of feedback, and I'm going to make suggestions. If I'm making too many suggestions, you let me know. But I'm going to assume that I have an active role to play here, and kind of let it go. You should have a ballpark idea of how long you want this process to happen. But I think that we should assume mentorship as just part of the leadership role. So nobody is going to do the job really well right at the beginning.
Yeah, thank you so much. Dr. Richard MacGillivray, thank you for joining us. This has been amazing.
My pleasure.
Well, thanks for joining this conversation. I trust that you were encouraged and challenged by the stories and experiences that were shared today. Would you join us next week? You can find new episodes weekly in video form on the Aaron Ministries YouTube page and in audio form wherever you get your podcasts. Aaron Ministries is an interdenominational network of friends in ministry with a mission to foster healthy Christian leadership. Check out our website, aaronministries.com, for more information and resources, and on how you can donate to our ministry and potentially start a healthy Christian leader gathering in your area. Until we meet again, may you experience the Lord's blessing, grace, and peace. I'll see you next week.